This is a lathe. Lathes have been used for hundreds of years, even before electricity. The basic idea is you're going to have a piece of material that spins really fast. You'll have a tool rest and be using different tools to shape that material. Examples of things turned on the lathe would be chair or table legs, baseball bats, bowls, platters, rolling pins. That's just to name a few. There's hundreds of different projects that you can do on the lathe, and they're really fun. Let me tell you a few things about staying safe while using the lathe. The first thing is to not let anything get caught in the spindle. Make sure if you have loose hair, loose clothing, loose jewelry, that those are secured back. You also want to be aware of your pinch points. Near the head center, near the tail center, in between the tool rest and your material are all areas that your fingers could get pinched. So just be aware of that and observe a margin of safety near those items. You want to make sure when you secure your material on the lathe that it's been secured correctly so that it won't come flying off the lathe as you turn. If you're turning something relatively small, like a pen, then safety glasses are adequate. But if you're turning something large or heavy or unbalanced, then I recommend wearing a face shield as well to give you some added protection in that instance. When you set up to turn on the lathe, you want to be certain that your tool rest is in the correct position, and you want to be very aware of what tool you are using. Different tools are used differently, and some tools are for very specific purposes on the lathe. If you just grab a random tool and use it however you want, then it's likely that you're going to break the tool and you could also injure yourself. So if you haven't used a tool before, ask before you use it. Get a little demonstration and instruction on how to be successful with it and how to stay safe. Make all your setups while the lathe is off, and then you can go ahead and turn it on. When you need to walk away from your lathe, you turn it off as well. The last thing isn't necessarily a safety item, but more of just a convenience. When you turn on the lathe, you're going to be creating a lot of sawdust and a lot of wood chips, and it's really easy for those to get everywhere. So I highly recommend wearing a turning smock that has a nice high collar to keep those wood chips out. Let me talk about some of the features on the lathe. There's a lot of different parts, and it's important to know what each one is called and what each one does so that you can do your best turning. First, we've got our bed. The bed is this big metal tabletop. To the bed, we have secured our headstock, our banjo, and our tailstock. Let's talk about each one of those. First, we have our headstock. If you open this door, you'll see that our head center is hooked to a belt that's hooked to the motor. Usually we leave that belt on the middle setting, but you could change it higher or lower for faster or slower speeds, or for more or less torque. We've got a hand wheel on the headstock that just allows us to manually spin the head center. The head center is what holds our drive centers. It's also threaded so that it can hold face plates and four-jaw chucks. We also have a locking pin just above the hand wheel. And as you're spinning the hand wheel, if you engage the locking pin, then the head center can no longer turn. So make sure when you're starting to turn that that locking pin is not in place. You want to make sure that it can turn freely. Before you start turning, you'll need to put a drive center into the head center. Drive centers do not spin on their own. They usually have a spike and some spurs or teeth that bite into that material. You simply insert it into the head center and you're ready to go. You want to make sure that this is biting into your material just a little bit because that's what's actually going to spin the material. If you need to remove the drive center, you'll use a knockout rod. You can insert this into the hand wheel, I recommend holding on to the center so that it won't fall out and get dented or dulled. And just tap, tap, tap. And that comes out. Next, we have our tailstock. The tailstock can be moved back and forth. To lock it in place, you'll use the locking lever in the back. Tighten that down, now the tailstock cannot move. You also have a hand wheel on the tailstock. The hand wheel controls the quill. The quill can be extended or retracted based on what you need. And when you get the quill in the correct spot, there is a locking bolt on the back. You can be fairly aggressive on the locking lever, but just tighten up the locking bolt. You don't need to be super aggressive on that, or you could break that plastic handle. Here are some examples of tail centers, or they're also called live centers. These centers spin, and they will copy whatever the head center is doing. So typically they'll have a little spike point, and some are shaped differently. You insert that into the quill, and then you can advance it as needed and tighten that down. And then this will spin freely. So this just copies whatever the head center does. Be sure to have your centers in the correct spot, the headstock or the tailstock. Otherwise, it won't work. When you need to remove your tail center, you don't use a knockout rod. You just retract the quill. When it's almost all the way in, it'll feel like it's done. And then you just keep going until the quill is all the way retracted and that tail center comes right out. The next part is our banjo. The banjo is what holds the tool rest. So banjo can be moved side to side, forward and back, and it also has a locking lever that can be tightened down into place. Our tool rest fits in this hole, can be rotated, raised and lowered, and when you get it to the correct spot, then you'll lock it in place with this locking bolt. Similar lever and similar locking bolt to the tailstock. Tool rests can be shorter or longer. You could also have a curved tool rest. There's a lot of different types. So depending on what you're turning, you'll use a different tool rest. When you're sanding or finishing, we want to remove the tool rest so that we get rid of that pinch point when we're doing those items. The next thing to point out is our control box down here. To turn the lathe on, you use this lever and you pull towards yourself. You'll notice the display shows you your RPMs, and this dial can control the RPMs. It's important to know the recommended RPMs for whatever you're spinning, because it may be very different depending on if you are spindle turning, faceplate turning, drilling, boring, things like that. To turn the lathe off, you press the lever back in. This switch over here controls forward or backward on the rotation of the headstock. We always leave it on forward, meaning that it is spinning towards you. There's very rare occasions that you would put it on reverse. You definitely don't want to mess with this switch while the lathe is on. So we've discussed safety guidelines and the different parts of the lathe, and now we're ready to show an example of how to start. The first thing to identify when you're going to turn on the lathe is if you are spindle turning or faceplate turning. Spindle turning is when your end grain is secured into the headstock and tailstock. So as you are turning, you are removing all long grain. End grain here, end grain here. An example of that would be chair legs, table legs, baseball bats, and so on. Faceplate turning is when you have something and here's the end grain, but we're going to put it on its side and spin it this way as if we're making a bowl or a platter. If you're going to do faceplate turning, then you secure your material with a faceplate. You'll screw that into place, and that's how you'd begin turning something like this. Spindle turning is the most common and is also the best for a beginner. So that's what I'll show you an example of. I'm going to turn this piece of poplar. The first thing I want to do on the lathe is to insert my drive center and my live center. I'm going to use my smaller tool rest that extends just beyond the ends of my material. The next thing you do is you want to make sure that you have identified your center points. I'm going to use a center finder like this. This can be used on square or round material, which makes it nice. And as I set that in place, then I can just draw a line, rotate it, draw a line. If you really want to be perfect centered, then you can do all four sides. And you can see that it's given me this little rectangle there, and in the center of that rectangle is the actual center of this material. So then I'm going to take a center punch like this, get it as centered as I can, and that clicks and provides a little indentation that makes it easier to load up on center. I'm going to do that to the other side as well. The closer you are to exact center means that you'll have less wobble as you put it on the lathe. So now I'm ready to secure this to my lathe. I'm going to put that center point matched up with my spike on my drive center. I'm going to release my tool rest and advance that forward until the centers match. And then I'm going to use the locking lever in the back to tighten that down. Now, this is now spinning, but if I spin my hand wheel here, then it's not actually turning it. If I turn the lathe on right now, it will spin the material, but it's not actually gripping the material. So be certain that we're gripping it correctly, and this is how, okay? As soon as you get those center points in place and you've locked your tailstock into place, then you're going to advance your quill and it's going to press your material into that drive center. And you want to be able to see that it's just biting into those spurs just a little bit. As you're advancing your quill, if you notice the entire tailstock sliding back, that just means that you need to be a little tighter on your locking lever in the back. Once your quill is nice and tight, then we're going to tighten that locking bolt so that the quill won't move back and forth as there's small vibrations on the lathe. Now, if I use my hand wheel, then it turns the material, and if I kind of go back and forth with my hands, I can feel that that material is nice and secure. The next thing is my tool rest. I'm going to bring the banjo over. Sometimes if it's hard to move, I'll kind of wiggle the locking lever as I go, and that seems to help. Okay, if you're too close, then your material is going to hit your tool rest. If you're too far, you're not going to have very good support, and you're going to feel a lot of resistance when you're turning. So you want to have your tool rest closer than an inch, not farther than an inch away from your material. And it depends on if you're using scrapers or gouges, but something like this, okay? And I'm temporarily going to tighten this locking bolt into place. Give it a spin by hand and make sure that you're not going to hit your tool rest. Okay, here's where we talk about some tools. The most basic tools I have in my shop are these easy wood tools that have carbide tips on the end. You'll notice that there's square, round, diamond, and these are meant to use as scrapers. When you're using a scraper, you are holding your tool completely level. If I stuck a bubble level on here, then that bubble should be right in the middle. So I'm not tilting it upward, I'm not tilting it downward, I'm just holding it flat. I'm okay to move side to side, and I'm okay to rotate this way, but you want to keep it totally level. You also, on these, can only use the first half of the tool. So, as soon as I get past this point on the tool rest, I gotta stop. I can't go all the way. Be kind to our carbide tips, because if you misuse the tool or if you drop it, then you'll get chips on those corners, and then the tool does not cut nearly as well. When you're holding your tool nice and level, you want it to contact the material in about the center. If we drew a line in between those center points, that's about where you want it contacting your material. So this looks like my tool rest is in a good position. Let me briefly point out some things about gouges. Gouges are used differently than scrapers, and gouges are sharpened with a bevel on the end. You've got the heel and the toe of the bevel. I've labeled all of my gouges, so you'll notice that this one says 1/2-inch bowl gouge, and this one says spindle roughing gouge. You really want to pay attention to if the gouge says bowl, then it's only for faceplate turning. If the gouge says spindle, then it is only for spindle turning. If you mix those up, chances are you'll break the tool, and it could be very unsafe and you could hurt yourself. When you're using a gouge, you want to match your tool angle with the bevel. That bevel should be riding flat against your material. So instead of holding your tool level at 90 degrees, you're going to drop that tool handle down a little, like so, and turn like that. If you want further instruction on how to use gouges, please get with me and I'll show you some tips. Gouges, if you use them correctly, can turn a little faster and a little cleaner, but they are a little bit trickier and take a little technique that the scrapers don't. So my students most often prefer to begin with scrapers, but then if you feel like you're getting the hang of it and if you're enjoying the lathe, then ask me to show you some gouges, because they can be really fun and useful as well. So I've got my square tip scraper, and we are ready to start turning this. When you're spindle turning, your first objective is to knock down all these corners and just take this to cylinder. Once it's a cylinder, then we can start shaping it further. So let's get turning and show an example. When I start turning material down to cylinder, I typically only use half the width of the tool. I do that so that I can do a plunging cut, which removes more material faster. If you use the entire width of the tool, then you have to slow down and take a little bit of a lighter cut. If you're cutting too aggressively, chances are that those spurs in the head center are going to tear through the material and your piece won't spin anymore. So here's an example. I turn the lathe on and I check my RPMs. They're at about 1900, which looks good. As long as your hand is behind the tool rest, then it's nice and safe to be close. And that actually helps with having more control. If you're holding it way back here, then there's much less control over what's happening. You'll notice there's kind of a blurry line on the top and bottom. As we get closer to actual cylinder, then you'll see that line become more defined. As this is spinning, it looks pretty much cylinder, so let's double check. I'll turn the lathe off. And as I'm spinning this, I'll notice I do still have some flat spots. So I'm not quite to cylinder yet. I'm going to switch over to my spindle roughing gouge. On this one, I'm going to move the tool rest a little closer. I failed to mention before that when you're using a gouge, not only do you drop your angle, but you want to be contacting the material at just above center. On a scraper, you hold it 90 degrees and contact at center. On a gouge, you drop your angle and you're contacting slightly above center. As I said before, we're creating quite a bit of sawdust and wood chips, which is kind of fun, but it's a good reason to wear a turning smock. Okay, so this is all rounded. This is down to cylinder. So now I would start shaping based on what project I'm doing. When you get to the point that you're sanding, you want to remove your tool rest so that allows you to have space for your hands to sand without the danger of pinch points. Same thing as you're applying finish. If you're using a finishing rag to apply finish, you do that with the tool rest out as well. So that was an example of the lathe. We talked about safety, we talked about the different parts of the lathe, and we talked about how to safely set up and secure for a spindle turning. I'll give additional instruction on faceplate turning and some more detailed instruction about gouges in different videos. Now that we're done, we want to make sure to clean up our area. Because there's so many different tools, different parts, then it can become quite a mess. So make sure to always put away your tools correctly, put away your centers correctly and any other items that need to be put away, to leave it totally clean for the next person to use. So that's the lathe. Please remember all the safety guidelines and be safe as you're having fun turning on the lathe.